Welcome to a conversation on international affairs. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our distinguished guest today is Professor Victor F. Weisskopf, Institute Professor of Physics at MIT. Professor Weisskopf is the 1988 Sanford S. Elberg Lecturer on the Berkeley campus. Professor Weisskopf is widely known for his theoretical work in quantum electrodynamics, the structure of the atomic nucleus, and elementary particle physics. He played a critical role in the formation of the European Center of Nuclear Research, CERN, in Geneva, where he served as director from 1961 to 1966. He is also known as an international statesman of science and as a leader in the promotion of peaceful uses of atomic energy, East-West scientific collaboration, and control of atomic weapons. Professor Weisskopf, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
You were present really at the birth of 20th century physics. You studied under Schrödinger at Berlin in 32, Bohr at Copenhagen in 33 and 35, and Pauli in Zurich 34 to 36.
Yes.
For an audience of non-scientists, can you convey a sense of the intellectual ferment of that time?
Certainly, I will try. It was one of the most exciting times in the history of physics, I would almost say. Of course, I came a little late. I mean, the great event was in the middle 20s when quantum mechanics was formulated and invented and discovered. And that happened in the different centers in Copenhagen and in other centers in Germany and England. And I came into physics in 28 as a graduate student to Göttingen. So I was, at that time, quantum mechanics was already here, although there were a lot of applications and extensions that were necessary and which were not yet done. But I felt a little like, I think, Alexander, who said to his father, the King Philips, that you have already conquered the world, what's there for me? But there was a lot. And, well, it was a different time, and there were much fewer physicists than now, and especially fewer physicists who were working on that frontier of atomic physics, which was at that time the frontier, the structure of the atom and the properties of the atom. And it was in a way a closed society. There were perhaps between 50 and 100 people whom we know all personally and came. There was a yearly conference in Copenhagen where they all came, and this was the great event. So it was a much more closed society. And of course at that time technical applications were still in the future, so that even the interest of the public or of technology, of industry, wasn't very great in what we did. Nevertheless, it was for us a tremendous time of new revelations.
And the situation was such that someone could write a dissertation and it would open up a new field.
Yeah. Well, maybe I was a little late for that, but certainly in the in the second half of the 20s, I said that in some of my writings that every dissertation opened a field. I know Felix Bloch's dissertation opened the field of solid-state physics, and so on. So Heitler and London opened the field of quantum chemistry. And so it was really a great time. And to my time, it was already a little developed, but still there were great problems. And I was lucky to be able to hit a problem of the relations between the atom and the light it emits, between radiation and the atom, and was also lucky to have the help of one of the great physicists that's still living, namely Eugene Wigner. And I think I was the first of the young people who worked with him, so to speak, first of his graduate students.
And there was really an enormous amount of internationalism here, just the
Yes.
campuses that you were at, or
Yes,
the university?
in particular in Copenhagen. I mean, in Copenhagen, anybody who came to Copenhagen was struck, pleasantly of course, by the international atmosphere there. I mean, there were of course a few Danes, but the majority were people from all over Europe and North America, And it was really a pleasure to be together with Russians, Germans, Italians, whatever. You know. And they all fighting and living for the same aim. And it was my first great and perhaps decisive experience in international science.
And who of these teachers most influenced you in your work? Or was it all? Or?
No, I certainly would put Niels Bohr and Wolfgang Pauli on top. And Niels Bohr had a tremendous influence. He is a father figure not only for me, but for many other people too. And his whole philosophy and his way of life and his way of looking at problems influenced us all tremendously. And I was lucky to have even a very close personal friendship with Niels Bohr up to his death. And Pauli, same, you know, I came to Pauli later. Pauli was also one of the Bohr disciples in a way, but he was at that time professor in Zurich, and perhaps one of the greatest events in my career as a young physicist was when I got a letter from Pauli asking me to come to Zurich and to be his assistant, that means his collaborator. And that was in 1930, end of 33. I started 34. And that was certainly for me a decisive moment to work with Pauli, to understand the way he works, and to be his amanuensis, his helper. That was a great experience, and I was there 3 years, which is unusually long for an assistant. And this relation with Pauli then remained until his death in '58. And then I still was very much busy with working up his intellectual estate and publishing his letters and so on.
How did the political turmoil of the time affect this period? We're talking about the interwar years.
Of course, these were about the worst years, I would say, for Middle Europe. I mean, just the years we were talking about. Hitler came to power in 1933. At that time, I was in Copenhagen, and I left Europe for the United States in 1937. This was just the years of Hitler's ascent, and of course that very tragic times for many of my relatives and people I knew well, and also for many of my colleagues. In some ways, I led a charmed life, and I don't know how it came about, but somehow I never really suffered personally in any persecution. Of course, I had difficulties finding jobs, and since I come from a German-speaking country, from Austria, the job possibilities in Austria and in Germany were very limited, or even impossible at that time for a person of Jewish extraction. But I was lucky enough to have been able, through a Rockefeller stipend, by the way, American money, to be able to spend some time with Niels Bohr, and then, of course, the position with Pauli. So I was lucky to be always outside the real turmoil, but we have seen enough of terrible things.
And Professor Bohr assisted you in finally locating in the United States?
Yes. I mean, Bohr played an incredible role there. I mean, during the later years, the later 30s, Copenhagen was sort of the haven for many persecuted German scientists of Jewish extraction. In a way, it was wonderful. You found in Copenhagen a wonderful company, you know, of James Frank and Otto Frisch and George Hevesy, all very famous people who had to leave their German positions and assembled there in Copenhagen. And Bohr was very active in getting money from English, American sources, and Danish sources, by the way, to keep us there. I had at that time a stipend which was paid by the Carlsberg beer factory. I always drink Carlsberg beer in gratitude for that. And and then it was really admirable to see how Niels Bohr not only was able to follow all the great advances at that time in nuclear physics and atomic physics, but at the same time traveled around to England, to America, and to other places to get jobs for his refugees, and very successfully so. And for example, the job that I finally got, a rather small instructorship at the University of Rochester, I thank him. He went there and recommended me for that job.
And at this time, you weighed an offer also from the Soviet Union?
Yes. I had been several times in Russia at that time, so I knew the Russian physicists. It was actually interesting. When I got this Rockefeller Fellowship to go to Copenhagen, the trouble was that the fellowship, I had to wait for about a little more than half a year, maybe 8 months, to get the fellowship paid out. And for that time, I decided to go to Soviet Russia. I was certainly not an enthusiastic communist, but I was interested because some of my friends said it's wonderful, and some of my friends said it was terrible. So I wanted to see with my own eyes, and I did have friends in Soviet Russia, indeed people who came from Vienna, whom I could ask, can I somehow spend time there for room and board? I don't need any pay. And indeed, I was there for 8 months in Kharkov, that is in the Ukraine, near Kiev. And I had a very interesting time, not only because the people there were very interesting physicists. One of them was Lev Landau, the very famous Nobel Prize Russian theoretical physicist. At the same time, I could see what's going on. I traveled in Russia. I certainly saw the backside of Stalinism. At that time, it wasn't yet so bad as it was later, but it was already visible that things are going in the wrong direction. But so I had a lot of friends there, and therefore, when in 1936, when I was sort of looking for a job, I got an offer for a full professorship with very good pay to Kiev. At the same time, when I got this offer of an instructorship with, I must say, a rather low pay, was $200 a month, which is more than $200 now, but it was still not very much. And it was quite clear to me. Actually, I visited Russia later on for shorter times in 1933 and then in 1936. It was quite clear to me that I would not go to Kiev under any condition. I think if I would have accepted it, I'm not sure I would be alive today. And so we decided to go to the States.
Were you a very political person during this period?
Well, I don't know what you mean by this. I was certainly, I mean, any thinking person at that time had to be interested. I mean, with the Nazism in Germany and with the whole turmoil, the threat of world war, and going from one place to the other, you know, Switzerland, England, Denmark, you're sort of bound to be interested in politics. So in some ways I would say yes, I was, but perhaps not more than many others. And in particular, I was interested in socialism. Is this a solution on communism? Is this a solution or not? And I'm actually very glad that I visited Russia for such a long time, because I really saw it from within.
What is it at the root of scientific inquiry? I mean, I don't know how to ask you this question, but what is the temperament that makes
you a scientist?
Yes.
Well, I think in a way it's very simple. It's just being interested in what's around you. You know, you want to know. And I had this from my high school days. Not through, I didn't have a very good high school teacher in physics or in natural science, but somehow at that time I just wanted to know, and I read books, too many, you know, popular books on science, because I was especially interested in astronomy, and my parents gave me a telescope. My father was a lawyer, so he was not at all scientific. But maybe on the contrary, he was sort of what one would call a humanist. And the whole atmosphere in my home was a humanist atmosphere. But it may be interesting for the Berkeley public that Hans Kelsen, who plays such a role here, he is a law professor, he was a friend of our house. And so in a way, I wanted to be different from my family, and though I was interested in natural science, in astronomy, I looked at the stars, I read books about the stars and about atoms, which at that time, of course, was a very important subject. So that is the way I came in. I just wanted to know what's all about.
Now, there is probably a misperception here, but one perceives a scientist as cold, calculating, rational.
Yeah.
But you don't agree completely with that formulation.
No, not at all. On the contrary, I now altogether, also in my later life, I always criticized the teaching establishment to emphasize this coolness and aloofness. If you're a scientist, you must be objective, facts, you know, you should not have your emotions play a role. I think that's all wrong. I mean, the scientific inquiry is a human activity. It's full of human drives and of whatever you want, of ambition and of joy or of tragedy, whatever you take. And so when in all my classes, I always try to be different from other teachers. Well, there are also teachers who think like me, to bring out the emotional angle, the joy of insight, you know, which I always try to emphasize, how wonderful it is when you suddenly or not so suddenly understand something and see, aha, that's this way. You know? And this is an emotional experience, which I think one has to transfer to the students.
You made a reference in your lecture last night to complementarity of thinking, and I've heard you say elsewhere that it is something that you developed in this education as you studied quantum mechanics.
Well, I would
explain that.
Yeah, I would say this is really I got this from Niels Bohr, from my spiritual father. That he always emphasized that the complementary angle, it means that there are different ways, which are often seemingly contradictory, to deal with experience. Now, first, of course, this was in physics itself, in quantum mechanics, that an electron is a wave and a particle, which seemingly contradictory, but it turns out these are just two different sides, two different aspects of the same reality. And then Bohr generalized this, and it was very impressive for me. I mean, I was always extremely caught by these ideas, that this different way of looking at it, seemingly contradictory, is one of the essential elements of human experience. Take an example. Let us say, of a piece of music. Now, I happen to be very much interested in music.
You're a pianist.
I'm a pianist, and actually before I took up physics, I was even thinking of going into music. But anyway, I take a sonata, a Beethoven sonata. I mean, you can describe this as vibrations of the air. You can describe it as nerve synapses in your brain. But these are complementary aspects of the musical aspect. The Beethoven sonata is an expression of emotions of a certain state of mind, which, of course, is the most important part. But so, or take another example, the beauty of a sunset. You can look at it from the point of view of scattering of light. You can look at it of the wonderful color combinations, the symbolic, the end of a working day, etc. And these are all valid, I would almost say equally valid ways of looking at human experience. And one, although they are contradictory, but they are not contradictory, they are complementary. And they add up. I think for me a sunset is more beautiful if I not only admire the color, but also think of how this color did come about.
Now, how does one discipline this, this emotional element so that it doesn't take away from truly analyzing? And
well, I mean, one has to be careful. I mean, even in art, let's say in music, one has to be careful and not to be too taken away by emotions, because after all, the study of composing or playing a piece of music is also a rational thing where you need emotions, but they shouldn't run away with you. And in some ways, it's in science too. Without emotions, science, you would not be able to do something great in science, because you need you need the drive. I'm quite sure that Einstein, especially because he speaks about it, that the beauty of those ideas were very important to him, and that's an emotional reaction. So there is emotion even in science. That's what I meant before, which people often suppress. So, but the main point of complementarity is that one way of looking at things, be it the scientific, be it the religious one, be it the artistic one, is not enough, and deprives you of many ways of understanding your environment. But even more, it is very dangerous, because if you only have one way of approach, it is open for abuse. We see it today in fundamentalism, creationism, and even worse in the East, with, well, maybe communism, although this is now less strong than it was, but the fundamentalism of Khomeini or Gaddafi shows that if you are only in one line, that's dangerous. Even the scientific technological line, if it is pursued without respect of anything other, namely moral or political or human aspects, leads to abuses, as we unfortunately know about the nuclear war and other things.
Are you satisfied with the way our educational system brings science to young people?
No, definitely not. Because, and there I have really to criticize very much. Not so much the college education, which of course also everything can be done better, And I'm always satisfied if people think about better ways of teaching. But I think the college teaching is, I'd say, relatively good, except what I said before about emotion and so. But when you come to high school or elementary school, I think it's simply terrible. I mean, the way science is taught in most high schools, there are always exceptions, good exceptions, fortunately. But if you look at the general way it is taught in high school, it's simply just to scare the kids off that subject, because they don't get at the essential. They don't get at the joy of insight, or even the independent way of finding something. The teacher should sort of lead the student that he should find the answer himself, either by trying it out on the table or by thinking. And these elements are neglected. And you can even start at the elementary school with very simple thing, how the water behaves in a glass. You see that all these things you can observe, and if you lead the kids in thinking about it, they will have tremendous pleasure with it, and they will understand the real nature of science.
How would you go about doing what you're saying? I mean, should the teachers have different training than just science?
Yes,
I mean,
definitely. The teachers should have different training, and I think the science schools, the teacher training schools, are not doing the right job. By the way, it's not only true for science, it's also true for other subjects. They are, as my daughter happens to be in a teacher training school and is very interested in elementary school, science in elementary school. She said that most of the teacher training is just driving out the good spirit of those few students who had it just from the beginning.
So that the materials are intimidating maybe to the people who are trying to teach.
And it could be done a lot better. Mm-hmm. But of course the point is that teaching is considered as not a very high standing profession, who does and who can't teaches. And this kind of attitude, the high school teachers are badly paid, the elementary teachers too. They are overloaded, and they have no time to think, and they have a much too narrow curriculum. And all this, I think a lot could be done better. And I see movements in this direction, that people are beginning to think about it, and there are working groups on this. My daughter, for example, is the principal investigator of an NSF project to teach science in elementary school. So people are beginning to see the problem.
And you've actually written a book for children, have you not? Or for
Well, it's not for children, but it is for young people. Yeah, Knowledge and Wonder, which actually is now already in the second edition and has been translated in many languages.
If I can shift gears here a minute, what are the consequences, in your view, of really the militarization of science in our time?
Well, that's of course a different and very difficult and sort of tragic problem. We are the whole world development, the confrontation between the superpowers have all these effects on us, not only on the United States, on other countries, namely the fear of being overrun and the fear of a nuclear war. And then the only way which has so far been seen and applied to prevent it is to get better, more and better weapons, in particular nuclear weapons. And of course that is in other words, the arms race. And the arms race is of course an impossible thing, because it is not a stable situation. With every new invention, there's a new spiral, and it is the wrong idea that we can maintain superiority, because the other side, the Soviet Union and now China even, are following us, so even sometimes being ahead of us. Now, this then has, how shall I say, has eaten up a lot of scientists. They need scientists, and they pay them well. It's easy to get a highly paid position, and that is not good for the whole spirit of science.
So then it really affects the problems that people can afford to look at? I mean, does it take away from this, this description you gave us earlier of the inquiring mind? I mean, it puts it along a certain track.
Sure. I mean, it puts it in a certain direction, and well, I do not think that it can kill the fundamental scientific urge of basic science, which is very strong. There will be always people who will do it. But it takes money away, it takes manpower away, and all this. At present, I do believe that almost 50% of the graduate students go into military, or researchers at least connected somehow with military applications. And that is, of course, is a loss. These people are very good, and if they went into basic science, I think it would even be better for the country also, not only from a philosophical point of view, but from a material point of view. Because as we all know, we have lost our commercial preponderance, and to some extent it is because there are not enough people who worry about peaceful applications. And I do personally, I believe this is a much more important front than the military front, because at present any kind of war between the superpowers, I think, is unthinkable. They both sides would know that this would be the end, would be suicide, and therefore the important thing for this country should be to keep or to re-establish its preponderance in commercial production, in the way of life. And that is getting lost.
Is this a problem that confronts your students? I mean, they get their degrees, and are they?
Sure.
They come to you.
They come to me and ask. They say, "Well, look here, I have an offer from Livermore or some other military laboratory. Very high pay, sometimes up to 60,000, a year, and I have a wife and a child. I couldn't find any other job. What shall I do?" In which case I say, well, I mean, this is a matter of conscience, but I can understand. I wouldn't never say you should not take that job, because I do not think that this problem can be solved by telling the young scientists not to work for the military. That cannot be done, because if A doesn't work, then there's B who will work. What you have to do is to change the direction of our policy.
And what sorts of changes are we talking about? I mean, in other words, you're suggesting here that that it's not just cutting back the number of weapons, but really the perceptions between the two adversaries.
It's also cutting back, you see, but I don't think cutting back alone will help. Indeed, I would rather say cutting back will never really happen except on some small edges like the present INF treaty, which is not of great significance, although it is of great significance because it's the first time that something is cut, but it is a very minimal cut. Now, I think we cannot get this cut in dangerous weapons if we stay as we are now in a confrontational fighting attitude with the other superpower. What we have to try on both sides, not only on our side, is to get from confrontation to cooperation. We have many common problems, not only the nuclear war problem, which is a common problem because both will be annihilated. But there are other common problems, environmental ones, the warming, the CO2, the warming of the atmosphere, the ozone layer, the forest, the dying of the forests, the third world, the proliferation of nuclear arms, which is neither in their nor in our interest. So there are many things where we have parallel interests. And if we are able to reduce this fear, which forces us to confront the other in an inimical way, what's good for them is bad for us, or what's bad for us is good for them, and so on. We have to change this attitude because it isn't true. There are many things that are good for us and for them. And this will, and we have now, fortunately, some indications that even in the Soviet Union, these ideas are coming up through Gorbachev and his people. So there is a chance, perhaps. I'm not sure whether it will work, but I think it's our only chance.
Throughout your career, especially after the explosion of the atomic bomb, you were actively engaged in promoting public consciousness on the nuclear threat and so on. What were the frustrations there? I mean, you and this group and Einstein saw very early that things had changed, but the message didn't get across really. Why not? What's the problem?
Well, Einstein expressed it by saying that you know, our change in how did he say it?
Change of thinking. We
had changed our technology, but we didn't change our thinking.
Right.
And I think this was a very important point. And we tried very hard, not only the committee with Einstein, where I was member, but also the Federation of American Scientists and the Union of Concerned Scientists. Many other organizations tried to tell the public that nuclear war is unthinkable, and that the armament race is extremely dangerous and brings us nearer to this, and the proliferation of nuclear arms to other nations is a terribly dangerous thing. So, but we did not. It was very difficult, because it was not only the fault of our policy. I mean, the Soviet Union policy of the Soviet Union was also very inimical and confrontational. So we were in a way also forced into it, but in many ways we were the leaders because we have a better technology. We were the ones that usually invented new kinds of weapons, and the Russians had to follow up, and that is the arms race spiral. And we preached all the dangers of this and didn't go very far. But I would say in the last decade or so, these ideas have become were better understood.
And why is that?
Well, I think it was not so. I always ascribe it to, I don't know, but I ascribe it to two things. First, the physicians, the physicians' organizations have come into play, and people have more confidence to physicians than to scientists, maybe good reasons.
So you're talking about things like the Physicians for Social Responsibility.
The Physicians for Social Responsibility, that is the National Organization of Physicians Against Nuclear War. And then I do believe that the Catholic Church played a role. There was this pastoral letter about 5 years ago of the American bishops that criticized strongly the moral basis of our deterrence policy. And I think all this had an effect. And what really made that change, because I think there is a change, maybe not enough, but there is a change. I am not a sociologist. I cannot really analyze, but I'm glad to observe it. Of course, lately I'm quite sure that Gorbachev's attitude played an important role, that just from that side, which is probably least expected by many people, come certain suggestions of cooperation instead of confrontation. And there is some hope that maybe we get somewhere.
So are these groups bringing the complementarity of thinking that you talked about?
Well, they don't talk that way, and maybe... well,
I mean, to the whole debate. In other words, if you have physicians talking about the dangers of nuclear war from a physiological impact on man.
Oh, sure. I mean, there is an element of complementarity there. But I think the main element is that the rethinking of the causes of our actions, which were fear of the other side, and misinterpretation, that whatever the Soviet Union does, we call aggressive, and whatever we do, we call defensive. And if you really analyze it, it's often not very different. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, etc. Actually, both superpowers are so much in fear of the other side that they want to increase influence, not because they want to conquer the world. I think both sides know by now the obvious truth that it is impossible for the Soviet Union to communize the world, and it is impossible for America, for the West, to destroy communism all over the world. Why? Because of the existence of atomic bombs. I mean, it would be suicide. So,
and this is what Einstein meant.
That's what Einstein meant, yes. And so there is a certain, I mean, I'm now optimist. There is a certain tendency towards agreement, towards saying, all right, let's live together. Our security alone can never be secure if your security isn't also guaranteed. In other words, the tendency of making one side secure at the cost of insecurity of the other, like, for example, building up arms that are better than the other. This will never work. And so that cooperation on things of the same interest, and after all, avoiding war is a common aim of both parts. So this, I hope, will slowly develop and will perhaps lead us to a less dangerous world.
In this, you see scientists as having a special responsibility.
Yes, but perhaps one should not exaggerate this. The scientists have a special responsibility because perhaps they know somewhat more about the effects of a nuclear war, like a nuclear winter, or the destruction, or the radioactivity produced in the soil. They may know a little more about it, but I don't think this is so important, also because it is now well known. Therefore, the role of scientists, well, as citizens, not as scientists, is important. And actually, the role of the social scientist is much more important now. What we need is innovation in social thinking. This is not a natural science. On the contrary, the natural scientists have a tendency of thinking of weapons, you know, that this weapon is destabilizing and MX is not fulfilling its purpose. We should rather have midgets or mobile things or submarine weapons. All these are important points, and I would not say the scientists shouldn't do it. But it's not the essential thing. The essential thing is the whole problem of confrontation of the other side with weapons. That cannot lead to any solution. And so we have to get together. Whether this is possible or not, I do not know. I'm not saying that the Soviet Union will do this with pleasure. I'm not sure how long Gorbachev will be in power, but at least we should try.
How important are Soviet scientists in the evolution of their system? Are they more important, do you think?
They are, I don't think they're more important, but they are, perhaps, yes, at this moment they are more important, because previously they had very little to say. And under the present regime, they have much more to say. And since I do know the Russian scientific community pretty well, perhaps better than other people, better than some other people, I would say that indeed there are Soviet scientists like Weisskopf or Zagdeev and others who have recently gotten much more influence on politics, on the government than they had before, and that influence is in the direction in which I would consider the correct one.
There is in this whole history of science that we're talking about, the positive side of the internationalism, the international, but there is the nationalist side also.
Of course, there is a nationalist side, and we have to fight it. The fundamentalism, both in this country and outside, although in this country perhaps it's not so dangerous, although these forces like creationism and anti-rationalism is rather bad. But the real danger, of course, is in Persia, in Iran with Khomeini, and in Libya with Gaddafi, where really fanaticism and religious fundamentalism represents a great danger. And indeed, the Soviet Union also suffers of it. Look at these recent nationalistic things in Armenia, which, well, these are consequences of the sins of previous Russian governments, but nevertheless, it's a dangerous development.
In what ways have these international scientific collaborations and interactions and settings, say like Pugwash, you were very active in Pugwash, succeeded in advancing this public consciousness that we've been talking about? So to tilt the balance toward internationalism and
well, to some extent it did. Of course, after all, the scientists, in order to be really effective, they have to have an influence on the government and Congress and public opinion. In our country, in the West, more than in the East, because public opinion and the parliament plays a more important role, and that makes it more difficult. But indeed, there are good examples to show that the scientist movements did some good. Let me give a few examples. The ABM Treaty. Now, to remind our listeners, that the ABM, it is now about 20 years ago, when the Soviet Union and America agreed to stop anti-ballistic measures, measures to prevent ballistic missiles to enter the country, on the basis that if you do this, the only effect will be that the other side will increase the number of missiles in order to get something through the defense. In addition, it was also clear to us that the defense will be a very difficult technical problem, and I'm not sure whether it succeeds. Now, it was interesting that at that time it was extremely difficult to convince the Russians. And it was the Americans, not only the scientists, also the American politicians that were in favor of it. And I do think at that time that Pugwash has contributed to convince the Russians, through the scientists, Russian government, that ABM is a good thing. And now the tables are reversed. And now this idea of SDI, to protect the United States against missiles, which is technically, well, one should never say impossible, but certainly, if possible, very expensive and far in the future, that this would solve the question. And it's only defensive. That's what the Russians said at that time. So the tables are reversed. And I hope that, but I still am quite convinced, and so are my friends, that SDI, if it ever succeeds, will only have the effect that the other side will increase their weapons in order to get through the defense. So it would only make things worse instead of better.
Isn't this an argument, the Star Wars program, that it's really technology that's driving the race, the arms race between
Well, it's politics and technology. It may become technology, because if you start a very expensive program with a lot of laboratories, a lot of engineers and scientists involved in it, then they get sort of enamored with the problem. It's very hard to give up a problem in the midst. So, and there is this intrinsic impulse, the momentum, the intrinsic momentum, once you start a big project, to go ahead with the project. And that's a great danger in the SDI case.
Is the relationship between weapons labs and universities a problem generally? MIT broke its relation with...
Well, it broke it, but I mean, true. And we had a very hard fight where I was also involved in. But, you know, it is not completely broken. At present, as you probably know, the SDI efforts are trying to fan out problems to the universities, again, with a lot of money. And it is at present very difficult to get research money at universities, more difficult than before. So some people grab this opportunity, saying that after all, it's only, usually these are not secret problems, this is an open problem, and it may be good for science. So it is certainly a great temptation, and many people have fallen for that temptation, and understandably. Again, I say, it's no use that a group, a small subgroup like the academic researchers, oppose a policy. A policy can only be changed if the people, Congress, opposes it.
I think we have a good sense of the scientific education of Victor Weisskopf. Also a little about your political education. What about the moral education of Victor Weisskopf? You clearly engage yourself in the problems of our time. What are the roots of that? Is it from the scientific inquiry, or?
No, well, no. It's very hard to say. I believe that the home has a lot to do with it. The education at home, not in school, but at home, that the moral aspect, and I should emphasize it is not does not come from religion. My home was not a religious home, but it was a very moral, I would say, with emphasis that you have to behave decently. And that is one thing. And the other thing is, of course, is that the time when I grew up, I mean, in the 20s, when I was an adolescent, these were very exciting and interesting political times. So you were almost drawn into considering this. And in some ways more optimistic, well, I wouldn't say that because it was also the birth of Nazism, but maybe that also, you see, that we saw, my generation saw the growth of this evil, and naturally then you think you have to do something against it. So in some ways the rise of Nazism was for us a moral education.
This will be our final question, what lessons should one draw or lesson from this extraordinary 80-year odyssey that you've undertaken? Any particular insight you would like to leave us with? Or?
Well, this is difficult to say, yes and no. I mean, first of all, as I said before, I and my family led a charmed life. I mean, we could just as well have ended in an annihilation camp. And we just as well have not been so lucky to get a job in the United States. And we didn't suffer at all. So therefore, it is an exceptional life. On the other hand, I would say that what I said before, you see, that this life has taught me that everything hangs together, that you cannot, this is the complementarity, that you cannot only be a pure scientist and nothing else. Not only because of your own interest, you see. I think if I had only science and not music and not art and not social problems, I would feel my life would not be so interesting. So in some ways I would say it's education. Now, of course, in my time the high school was better than it is now, but that is not the main point. It is, as I said, the influence of home. We must have a better education. an education that emphasizes those ideals and the many-sidedness of things, science, art, religion also, and social responsibility. If we do get this into the minds of people, perhaps we can reduce this kind of cynicism and negativism that is now so rampant, drug culture, passive TV entertainment, and so on. Now, maybe I'm an optimist, but I think these are the points which I would take for my life as the important things for humanity.
Professor Weisskopf, thank you very much for sharing these thoughts with us. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation on international affairs with Professor Victor Weisskopf of MIT.
For information on this series, contact the Institute of International Studies, 215 Moses Hall, UC Berkeley, Berkeley, California 94720, or call area code 415-642-2474.